You know, it often feels like the wrong people are in power, that they use power in ways that are just sinful and awful, and people get hurt. And you can look around the world, really, and see the abuse of power, really on national scales, very often as you look at like military dictatorships and really how they clamp down on any kind of dissent and just sometimes just brutal regimes that we can see around the world. It certainly happens that there's abuse of power. But of course, it's not just around the world. It's right here in Canada. There can be abuse of power. We can see it, well, any group of people, really. It can be the workplace. There can be a terrible abuse of power. It can also happen in church, in the lives of churches, that there can be abuse of power. And of course, it can also be in families. And you know, family is really the place that you're meant to feel the most secure. And unfortunately, it happens that there's abuse of power there. Whether there's mental abuse, physical abuse, spiritual abuse, it can happen too, but also, of course, sexual abuse and emotional abuse. There's all kinds of abusive things can happen. Terrible abuse of power in those relationships. And so we're going to be looking at power today. And you know, as we think about this, let's think about the 7 deadly sins. Now, I'm going to read them to you. I don't have them memorized because I'm not very good at them. But here they are. The 7 deadly sins are listed as pride, greed, wrath, envy, lust, gluttony, and sloth. Now, I must admit to being very good at gluttony. And in fact, that's one of the few sins that we pastors can get away with, it seems, in our churches. In fact, I'd almost say it's encouraged. Not that I'm complaining. And we don't just look forward to being together. We also look forward to eating together too with Pam's peanut butter squares. But anyway, that's enough of thinking about gluttony. When it comes to those 7 deadly sins, you know, the worst of those, I think, has to be the abuse of power. Except that it's not actually one of the 7 deadly sins, which is interesting. Why isn't it? When throughout the history of the world, ever since Cain and Abel, we've seen this terrible abuse of power and how it brings awful harm to people. Why isn't it one of the 7 deadly sins? Well, it's probably because the people that came up with the list of 7 deadly sins were people in power. And that's something that power can do to us, is it blinds us actually to the sin of our power when we're in power. So that's something interesting to think about. And you know, we often talk about the power of sin, but how often do we talk about the sin of power? Well, we're going to talk about it today because our scripture reading points us to the sin of power today, the abuse of power today, because Jesus, ever since he rides into Jerusalem on a donkey, that Holy Week, that 1 week of time between riding into Jerusalem and being crucified, we see the sin of power. We see the abuse of power. So let's take a look at it and see how this can help us in our day. And so the first thing we want to consider are the religious leaders. They really want to have power over Jesus, and for obvious reasons. Just think back to all his time of teaching, and people were like, wow, this teaching is amazing. He teaches with authority and not like the religious leaders. You can imagine them getting a bit jealous, right? And Jesus, he's not even schooled, whereas the religious leaders, you know, they're educated. So that would have caused some jealousy. Maybe that's where it all begins. But then Jesus is going around doing really good things too. He's being very helpful in the lives of people, doing things like miracles. Jesus is very helpful in a way that the religious leaders just aren't, of course. So again, maybe some more jealousy. And then, of course, Jesus is doing things that the religious leaders say not to do. They're like, don't do anything on a Sabbath. Don't heal on a Sabbath. And Jesus is like, oh yeah, well, watch this. And time again, he does things he's not supposed to according to them. So that's going to rub them the wrong way. And worst of all, Jesus ends up saying things that to their ears sound blasphemous. Things like, your sins are forgiven. And they're like, who can forgive but God alone? Who does this guy think he is? And it gets worse from there. When the religious leaders bring Jesus before Pilate, well, let's just read it. Let's see what they have to say. Pilate tried to release Jesus, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are no friend of the emperor. everyone who claims to be a king sets himself against the emperor. And then Pilate, he tries to release Jesus again, but he says to them, "Here's your king." And they cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate asked them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." We have no king but the emperor. Now that's the lowest place any person of God's people could get to, of saying we have no king but Caesar. And these are the religious leaders that are inciting people to say this kind of thing, that we have no king but Caesar. Because what happened to the promise of the king that is to come, of knowing the promises of God? What happened to the idea actually of God is our king? That was something they should have clung to. We have no king but God, and we have no earthly king but whomever God chooses and anoints for us. So that's what they should have been saying. But here they have sunk to the lowest place they could get. We have no king but Caesar, they yell. How can that be? Well, you see, the sin of power can blind us to God, what God is doing. It can blind us it can make us forget God. And here's the religious leaders. They didn't see that here's Jesus, he's actually from God. In fact, as fully gets figured out, he's God with us. They didn't see that Jesus is from God. They didn't see what God was doing through Jesus. They were blinded to that. And they didn't see, they forgot even what they stood for, that they stood for God as being their king. Does that happen to us? That the sin of power causes us to forget God, causes us to forget our values and our beliefs? Does the sin of power blind us like it did the religious leaders? Now, it's not just the religious leaders, of course, who committed the sin of power here. It's also Pilate. And Pilate, he commits the sin of power. He's the one that really calls the shots here, and he's the one that really calls for the crucifixion of Jesus. He's the one that makes the decision in the end. But before he gets there, notice what he says to Jesus. And he says this, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Do you not know that I have power to release you and power to crucify you?" Now, notice what Pilate's thinking about himself here. I've got the power over you. I've got the power of life and death over you. And Jesus answered him, "You would have no power over me unless it had been given you from above." Jesus puts him in his place. And he's like, you think you have power, but actually there's one over you that has more power than you. You need to pay attention to that. You need to pay attention to him. But here's what the sin of power does to us. It causes us to overstep our God-given responsibilities. Pilate was given this responsibility, and it could be a good thing. He could take care of the people in a good way. But the sin of power causes us to overstep. And when we overstep, we no longer take care of people and have responsibility for them. We inflict damage on them instead. We hurt them, we destroy them. As has happened so often with different kings and queens and leaders of nations overstepping their boundaries, has happened too often with even mums and dads overstepping their boundaries and becoming abusive in family situations. And not just mums and dads against children, but abuse can happen in so many ways in families between different family members. And of course it can happen in any group of people. But God gives us power as this beautiful responsibility and this power to do good. And we can really make a mess of that. And the sin of power, it goes to our heads and it becomes abusive and we create harm and hurt. So that's Pilate. But let's not just think of Pilate here. Let's also think of Pilate and all the rest of the Romans here as they have power over all the Jews. And so here they bring Jesus out wearing purple and wearing this crown of thorns. And they bring Jesus out and they're like, "Here is your king. And they mock him as this kind of pathetic king, and they're like mocking him and, "Hail, King of the Jews," and it's just this horrible scene of mocking. And we get the idea that they're mocking Jesus, but they're not just mocking Jesus, they're mocking all the Jewish people there. They're saying, "Here is your king, what a pathetic king, and here is your king, what a pathetic people you are." You see what they're doing there? They're belittling, not just Jesus, they're belittling everybody there. They're really mocking them all. And there's something the sin of power can do to us as well. That when we commit that abuse of power, that sin of power, we belittle others. We make them out to be nothing. We make ourselves out to be something. We make them out to be wrong. We make ourselves out to be right. There's all kinds of ways in which we can maybe mock them, maybe gossip about them, maybe try to get them smaller in other people's eyes. The sin of power, it causes us to belittle others. And so if that's a sin we commit, we want to confess that, of course. All right, so that's Pilate and the Romans, but let's focus in on the soldiers now, because they also have power here. They have the power actually they're the ones who finally take the life of Jesus. They're the ones who pull the trigger, shall we say. And so let's think about them for a moment. And really, let's remember that where they're at in this story, they're only there because it really started with the religious leaders, of how the Jewish religious leaders, they're like, "We have to get rid of this Jesus. If we don't, it's going to go really badly for us as a nation. All the people are going after him. And it's really going to go badly for us. We need to deal with this Jesus problem." And so they bring him to Pilate. And then Jesus becomes Pilate's problem. And Pilate has this problem that if he doesn't deal with this pretend king, then it's going to look like, wow, this pretend king is as good as Caesar kind of thing. And no, Caesar is the only king here, so any pretend king needs to be dealt with. So Pilate has to deal with this Jesus problem. And then, of course, he's handed off to the Roman soldiers, and Jesus becomes their problem. If they want to keep their job, if they want to keep their positions, and they had positions of power really as soldiers, then they had better deal with this Jesus problem and carry through with this crucifixion, which of course they do. You see what happens here with the sin of power. We become complicit. They all through the story, whether it's the religious leaders, Pilate, or the soldiers, they all become complicit in killing someone. They all become complicit in murder. And that's something that can happen, is when we commit the sin of power, we can become complicit in killing. Now you're going to say to me, "Now, Pastor, I've never murdered anyone." Good. I'm really glad about that. But when we commit the sin of power, do we kill someone's dignity? Do we kill someone's humanity? Do we kill someone's freedom? Do we kill someone's joy? Do we kill someone's conscience? Do we kill someone's mental health? Do we kill someone's dreams and aspirations? Do we kill someone's faith, their faith in God? Are we responsible for killing that when we commit the sin of power? Jesus entered into Jerusalem in a way that says, "Here I am, I really am in charge here. I am the rightful king." And up until this point, he's been very quiet, actually. The demons, they know who he is, and he warns the demons, "Don't you dare tell people." The disciples, they've come to realize that Jesus is the Messiah, the Christ, the Anointed One. But Jesus is like, keep quiet about that. But here he is, when he comes into Jerusalem, he does so in a way which says, "Hi, I really am the rightful king. I really am the Messiah who has come to liberate you from your oppressors. Here I am, your king, your rightful king." And so that's something he's made very public there. And then he goes into the temple, clears out the temple, and that's really a sign of authority too, of here I am, I'm in charge, and you need to listen to me. And so here he is, taking this position of here I am the king, and then he takes his place, not at the throne, but on a cross. You see, Jesus is a very different kind of king and a very different kind of kingdom. Most kings would come in and they would destroy the enemy, and then they would take the throne. Jesus comes in and basically he's destroyed by the enemy, but then he will take the throne. There's a big difference there. You see, Jesus could have come in and taken the throne, and he could have called 10,000 angels to come and rescue him. In fact, people were saying to him as he hung on the cross, why don't you ask God to save you if you're that great? Jesus never made that call. He could have called 10,000 angels not just to rescue him, but to destroy all who opposed him. He could have called 10,000 angels to wipe out the religious leaders that hatched this plan to kill him in the first place, to wipe out Pilate, to wipe out the Roman soldiers, to wipe out all the Romans, he could have called 10,000 angels to take him directly to the throne. But he didn't. You see, that's the way of the world. To destroy, to use power, to take the throne. The throne belongs to Jesus. It's his rightful place. But rather than using his power to destroy, rather than committing the sin of power, instead he destroyed the power of sin. He chose the nails. He chose to say, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. He chose to set up the possibility of the enemy being forgiven, and that includes us. When we become enemies to God because of our sin and our brokenness, and Jesus says, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. He took the cross for us. The way is open for forgiveness. The way is open for us to be reconciled to God, to be with Jesus for now and through eternity. That's the kind of king Jesus is, and that's the kind of kingdom Jesus is setting up. Not one where there's the sin of power, and that's how people hold on to power, but one where he is the rightful king, but he breaks the power of sin. Jesus loved his enemies at the cross instead of destroying them. Are we learning to love our enemies? Or do we do what enemies do and commit the sin of power? Do we recognize how God loves us at the cross? That Jesus did that for us? Are we committing the sin of power against God? Or are we receiving his wonderful love and grace? Maybe this is an appropriate week for confession. This Holy Week, as we consider this time between the triumphal entry of Jesus and his crucifixion, this is an appropriate time for confession. Do we commit the sin of power? And have we allowed God into our lives so that he can break the power of sin?